Let me ask you a strange question. If you could create God, what would he look like? Or what would he be like? Would he agree with you politically? Would he approve of your lifestyle? Would he share your opinions about money, sex, justice, religion, success, marriage, forgiveness? Would he like the same people you like? Would he dislike the same people you dislike? Would he understand why your sins aren't really as bad as everybody else's? Would he ever tell you no? Would he ever look at something you deeply believe and say, "You're wrong"? Because I've been thinking about something since Kat and I recorded our last episode, Spiritual but Not Religious. And the thought has bothered me. If the God I believe in always agrees with me, which one of us is actually God? Human beings have been trying to figure out God for as long as we've been human. We've looked at the sun, we've looked at the moon, thunder, birth, death, sex, violence, love, disease, the seasons, the stars, our own consciousness. And we've asked, what's behind all of this? And we've come up with some fascinating answers. Zeus, Odin, Krishna, Shiva, the gods of Babylon and Egypt, spirits, ancestors, nature, the universe, energy. And today, maybe we've simply replaced them with a different gods. Money, success, politics, sex, identity, and perhaps the most tempting God of all, ourselves. So today I want to do something different. I'm not going to leave you hanging at the end of this episode with another question. I've been asking questions for several episodes. Does truth exist? What if I'm wrong? Can I simply define spirituality for myself? Those questions have taken us somewhere. Today, I want to land the plane. Because maybe we don't need to invent God. Maybe God has already shown us what he's like. So let's go looking. Welcome back to Crusade With Me. This is a podcast about questions. Not because questions are the destination, but because sometimes the right question exposes an answer we've been avoiding. Around here, we'll be looking at ancient wisdom, philosophy, religion, history, human behavior, scripture, and occasionally some things that make all of us a little uncomfortable, including me. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to think with me, because I don't want a faith that's afraid of questions. I don't want answers I'm unwilling to question. I want the truth. Even when the truth changes me. The truth is worth seeking. So let's get walking. The gods we created. For most of humanity, let me be clear, atheism has not been the default. Human beings looked around at existence and concluded something is going on here. Something bigger than us. Different civilizations gave that something different names and different faces. Let's just start with the Greeks. Think about Zeus, king of the gods, thunderbolt in his hand, powerful, authoritative, terrifying when angry. But read the stories about Zeus and something interesting happens. Zeus can also be jealous, lustful, deceptive, vindictive. He has affairs. He gets angry. He manipulates. He competes. In other words, Zeus is incredibly powerful, but he's also incredibly human. It's almost as though somebody took human nature and turned the volume all the way up and then looked north. Odin, the Norse god associated with wisdom, war, poetry, magic, and death. And Odin fascinates me because Odin wants wisdom badly enough to suffer for it. According to the mythology, he sacrifices an eye for knowledge. He hangs upon the world tree in pursuit of the ruins. There's something there I actually find compelling. Wisdom costs something. Knowledge costs something. Understanding requires sacrifice. But Odin is also cunning. He can deceive. He manipulates. He seeks knowledge partly because knowledge is power. And again, there's something incredibly human about him. Then we move east. Hindu tradition gives us a completely different and far more complicated picture. Take Krishna. Depending upon the Hindu traditions, Krishna may be understood as an avatar of Vishnu, or worshipped as the supreme divine reality himself. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna speaks with Arjuna about duty, action, devotion, knowledge, liberation, and the nature of reality. This isn't primitive nonsense. These are sophisticated human beings wrestling with enormous questions. What is my duty? How should I act? What is the self? What is ultimate reality? How do human beings become liberated from suffering and attachment? Then there's Shiva. Shiva is associated with destruction, but calling him simply the god of destruction misses a lot. Destruction is connected with transformation, creation, disillusion, renewal, meditation, asceticism. The famous image of Shiva as Kataraja, the cosmic dancer, portrays this enormous cycle of creation and destruction. Again, human beings looking at reality and asking, what does all this mean? We could debate the. I'm going to say go back further. I don't know if it's truly true. Timelines are a little fuzzy about some of these beliefs. But go back to Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Cana. Civilizations filled with gods. Gods of storms, gods of fertility, gods of war, gods of rivers, gods of death, gods connected with kings and empires. And sacrifice becomes part of the relationship. You give something to the gods, food, animals, offerings, sometimes blood. In some ancient cultures, even human life became part of sacrificial practices. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not bringing these religions up to ridicule them. Actually, I want to do the opposite. I want to understand the question underneath them. Because intelligent human beings were looking at the same reality we're looking at. Birth, death, storms, harvests, war, love, suffering, sex, disease, consciousness, the heavens, and asking, what's behind it? Here's a couple questions I want to give you to just ponder. What do the gods human beings imagine tell us about human beings themselves? Here's another one. Why do so many gods resemble the cultures that worship them? And if we lived 3,000 years ago, what would we believe? We've never stopped making gods. See, here's where the modern people, we can get smug. We hear stories about Zeus throwing thunderbolts and Odin hanging from a tree, ancient sacrifices, and think, well, thank goodness we've evolved beyond all that. Have we? Maybe we didn't stop making gods. Maybe we just stopped carving them out of stone. Think about money. Money is useful. Money feeds families. Money builds homes. Money creates businesses. Money can do enormous good. But money makes a terrible god. Because once money becomes ultimate, it starts demanding sacrifices. Time, marriage, integrity, health, relationships, sometimes your entire life. And here's the problem with the god of money. It never says enough. Then there's success. Same thing. Achievement is good. Excellence is good. Work matters. But success can become a god. And success also demands sacrifices. Your kids can become the sacrifice. Your spouse can become the sacrifice. Your health, your conscience, your character. Then politics, we can say the same thing, right? Oh boy. Politics matter. Government matters. Justice matters. But politics can become religion remarkably quickly. I'm not joking. It has its saints. It has its demons. It has its orthodox beliefs. It has heretics. It has sacred slogans. It has prophets. It even promises salvation. If our people can just get enough power, everything will finally be okay. Sounds familiar? Then there's sex. Again, sex itself isn't the problem. But take any good thing and make it the ultimate thing, and eventually it owns you. And then we arrive at perhaps the most interesting modern god. The self. My truth. My identity. My desires. My fulfillment, my happiness, my spirituality, my God, my body, my life, my choice. And suddenly, I'm both worshiper and God. That connects us directly back to our last episode, spiritual but not religious, because one danger of individualized spirituality is that I can construct a belief system where I choose everything. Little Christianity, maybe some Eastern philosophy, energy, manifestation, astrology, maybe a little tarot, crystals, meditation, whatever resonates with me. Now, I'm not saying everyone involved in those practices believes the same thing, because they absolutely don't. All right. Take modern witchcraft. Now, I want to be clear. Witchcraft isn't actually one religion. Some practitioners are Wiccan. Some are pagan. Some believe in gods or goddesses. Some believe in spirits. Some talk about nature or energy. Some treat ritual almost psychologically or symbolically. Some may even identify as Christians. So we need to be fair. But the interesting question for me isn't, are those people weird? Because that's useless. The interesting question is, how did you determine that your picture of reality is true? And Satanism provides an even stronger example. A lot of people would assume Satanists worship a literal Satan. Well, many don't. Some modern prominent Satanist movements are atheistic. Satan isn't necessarily understood as a supernatural being. He can function as a symbol of rebellion, individualism, self-determination, human appetite, freedom from external religious authority. There are also people who do believe in Satan or other spiritual beings. Again, these categories aren't simple, but think about the irony. You can apparently have Satanism without believing Satan exists, which tells us something important. Sometimes the object of worship isn't actually a supernatural being. Sometimes it's an idea. Sometimes it's a value. Sometimes it's a desire. And sometimes it's power. And sometimes it's me. All right, here's something else to think about. What gets the final word in my life? Or what am I unwilling to surrender? Okay. What do I sacrifice other things to obtain? What, if threatened, makes me feel like my entire identity is under attack? Because maybe the question isn't whether I worship. Maybe the question is, what sits at the top of my hierarchy? The great reversal. Now I want to open the Bible. But rather than grabbing a handful of verses and trying to prove something, let's step back and look at the story. Because the biblical story opens with something absolutely fascinating. In Genesis 1, the ancient world is filled with stories about gods. And then Genesis makes this claim. There is one creator. The sun isn't God. The moon isn't God. The sea isn't God. The animals aren't gods. Creation itself isn't God. God creates them. And then comes humanity. In Genesis 1:27, it is written, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Think about that. We spent half this episode talking about human beings creating images of gods. Then Genesis goes and reverses the whole thing. We weren't supposed to create God in our image. We were created in His. That changes everything. Human beings are supposed to represent God within creation, to reflect His character, His goodness, His wisdom, His creativity, His stewardship, His love. We're image bearers. But the biblical story doesn't stay beautiful for long. Because human beings decided we want something else. We want to define good and evil for ourselves. We want autonomy. We want control. And eventually, we start making gods, images, idols, golden calves, things we can see, things we can manipulate, things we can control. And here's the irony. An idol doesn't have to be a statue. It just has to be a God small enough for me to control. And before we Christians start feeling superior, religious people do this too. And maybe especially religious people. I can create a Christian God who conveniently shares every one of my opinions. My God votes like me. My God likes my denomination. My God agrees with my interpretation. My God understands why my sins aren't really that serious. My God is furious about their sins. My God loves the people I love. And fortunately, he can't stand the people I can't stand. And at that point, have I submitted myself to God? Or have I simply given my opinions a divine endorsement? That's uncomfortable. For me too. Because I'm capable of doing it, and I've done it. You're capable of doing it. Pastors do it. Priests do it. Churches do it. Entire denominations can do it. And eventually we can become very good at worshiping ourselves using religious vocabulary. And that's where our last several episodes finally converge. Is something true even if nobody believes it? Yes. What if I'm wrong? Then I need the humility to change. Can I simply define spirituality for myself? Not if something outside of me is actually true. And now, can I define God according to my preferences? No. So we finally reach the question we've been avoiding. If I don't get to define God, who does? And Christianity gives an extraordinary answer. God does. So what if God showed us what he is like? This is where I don't want to tease anymore. I don't want to finish this episode saying, interesting question. We'll talk about it again next week. Nope. We've been walking towards something. So let's get there. Christianity makes an outrageous claim. Not simply that human beings discovered God. Not simply that philosophers reasoned their way toward God. Not simply that priests developed the correct religion. Christianity claims God revealed himself. And ultimately, not through an idea, not through a philosophy, not through a political system, not even primarily through a religious institution, through a person. Jesus of Nazareth. Paul writes in Colossians 1:15 that Christ is the image of the invisible God. There's that word again. Image. Genesis. Humanity created God's image. That's the way we were made, in his image. Then humanity spends history creating gods in ours. And now Christianity says, want to know what God actually looks like? Look at Jesus. So let's do that. What kind of God do we see? Jesus kneels down and washes feet. Think about the ancient gods we've discussed. Kings, thunderbolts, power, war, glory. And Jesus takes a towel, gets on his knees, and washes dirty feet. What kind of a God does that? Jesus encounters lepers. People everyone else avoids. He touches them. Jesus encounters sinners. And he eats with them. Jesus encounters religious hypocrites and confronts them. Jesus encounters people trying to trap him and refuses to play their games. Jesus encounters a woman caught in adultery and somehow manages to take sin seriously while refusing to destroy the sinner. Jesus sees children. He welcomes them. He sees the poor. He dignifies them. He sees the powerful. He isn't impressed. He sees his enemies. And he tells his followers, love them. I gotta be honest. That's not the God I would invent. But because if I'm creating God, my God destroys my enemies. My God proves I'm right. My God humiliates people who hurt me. My God puts me on top. But Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Forgive. Serve. Give. Lose your life to find it. Become like a child. The first will be last. The greatest becomes the servant. Let's be honest, this kingdom is upside down. And then we get to the cross. the God on the cross. I want you to think about something. For thousands of years, human beings sacrificed things to the gods. Food, animal, treasure, blood, sometimes even human beings. Something valuable was placed upon an altar. Something was given to the gods. And then Christianity makes one of the most outrageous claims in human history. In Jesus Christ. God gives himself for us. We expect human beings to climb the mountain looking for God. Christianity says God came down looking for us. We expect servants to wash the king's feet. Jesus washes the servant's feet. We expect sinners to be afraid to approach God. Jesus eats dinner with them. We expect the defeated person hanging on the cross to be the loser. Christianity says, that's the king. And while he's being crucified, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. I don't know that I would invent that God. Would you? Because human beings know how to imagine power. We know how to imagine domination. We know how to imagine vengeance. We know how to imagine gods who crush their enemies. But Christianity points towards a crucified Messiah. Paul says this sounded like foolishness. Of course it did. Because this isn't how power is supposed to work. But here's where Christianity doesn't stop. Because if Jesus simply dies, we have a beautiful tragedy. Maybe an extraordinary moral teacher. Maybe a martyr. Maybe an example of sacrificial love. But Christianity makes another claim. The tomb was empty. Jesus rose. Death doesn't get the final word. Violence doesn't get the final word. Empires don't get the final word. Sin doesn't get the final word. The cross and resurrection together announce something entirely different about the nature of God and about reality itself. God's answer to evil isn't simply greater violence. It is self-giving love that passes through death and came out on the other side alive. Now we're finally getting somewhere. Because remember where we started. What kind of God would you create? Maybe Zeus, maybe Odin, maybe something like the divine reality described within the Hindu traditions, maybe spirits, maybe energies, maybe the universe, maybe money, maybe politics, maybe success, maybe pleasure, maybe a carefully constructed spirituality, maybe simply a bigger version of yourself. But Christianity says, stop inventing him. Look at Jesus. And I'm not asking you to believe that because I said so. Examine him. Read the Gospels. Look at his character. Look at his claims. Look at his enemies. Look at his friends. Look at the cross. And then wrestle honestly with the claim of the resurrection. Because ultimately, we're not trying to determine which God we like best. We're trying to determine which claim is true. Respecting somebody else's beliefs doesn't require me to pretend our beliefs are identical, because they're not. And they can't all mean the same thing because they make genuinely different claims about reality. So examine them. Ask questions. Don't be afraid. I spent the last several episodes asking questions, and I've enjoyed doing it. Maybe I've even enjoyed the safety of not always having to tell you exactly where I've landed, but eventually, questions have to take us somewhere. And this one keeps bringing me back to Jesus. Not because I understand everything. Believe me, I don't. Not because Christians have always represented him perfectly well, because we haven't. Not that religions have never been corrupt, because they have. But because when I ask, what is God actually like? I keep coming back to the person of Jesus Christ. And here's the part that's beginning to turn the whole question around on me. Maybe my biggest problem isn't figuring out whether God looks enough like me. Maybe the question I've been asking is backwards. Genesis says, I was created in his image. Christ, show me what that image looked like. So perhaps the real question isn't, does God look like me? It's, do I look anything like him? And maybe that's where we need to finish today. Not with another teaser. Not with another cliffhanger. An answer. Human beings have been searching for the divine for thousands of years. We've created images, myths, temples, philosophies, religions, rituals, ideologies. And modern people haven't stopped. We still create gods. We just give them different names. But the biblical story begins by telling us that we were never supposed to create God in our image. We were created in his. And Christianity says that when humanity wanted to know what the invisible God was actually like, God gave us an image. Jesus Christ. And what we saw wasn't exactly what human beings expected. A servant, a healer, a teacher, a friend of sinners, a challenger of religious hypocrisy, a lover of enemies, a king wearing a crown of thorns, a God willing to die, and a tomb that couldn't hold him. So I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to construct a God who agrees with me. I don't want Lutheran Jesus, or Orthodox Jesus, or conservative Jesus, or progressive Jesus, the American Jesus, or Dave's Jesus. I want to know Jesus. And when something I believe doesn't look like him, maybe that's the thing that I need to change. That's different from me saying I have everything figured out, because I don't. Actually, I'm becoming increasingly comfortable admitting that. But I'm also realizing something else. Intellectual humility doesn't mean I can never arrive at an answer. I can say, this is where I've landed, and still keep asking questions. I can be committed and curious, convinced and teachable. I don't want a faith that's afraid of questions. I don't want questions that are afraid of answers. I don't want answers I'm unwilling to question. I want the truth. And when the truth changes me, and maybe that's what this crusade has really become all about, not convincing God to look more like us, but allowing Christ to make us look more like him. So I'll leave you with one question. Not because I'm teasing for the next episode. This one is yours to carry. Look at Jesus. Then look at yourself and ask, do I look anything like him? The truth is worth seeking. So let's keep walking. Thanks for spending this time with me here on Crusade With Me. This episode made you think. Don't just agree with it. Don't just agree with it. I want you to examine it. Go read the gospel for yourself. Ask difficult questions. Challenge what you've always assumed. Challenge what I've said today. And most importantly, look at Jesus. If you know somebody who's wrestling with God, religion, spirituality, or simply trying to figure out what they believe, send them this episode. Maybe don't tell them what they're supposed to think. Just invite them into the conversation, because what we're doing here, we're asking questions, we're looking for answers, and we're trying to have enough humility to follow the truth wherever it leads. I'm Dave. This is Crusade With Me. The truth is worth seeking. Until next time, let's keep walking, picking them up and putting them down. And as always, please continue to crusade with me.